Professor Koze, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for the opportunity to join you, albeit virtually, for this important discussion. I regret that I'm unable to be with you in Ankara in person. Turkey occupies a uniquely important place within the alliance, and throughout my years at NATO, I greatly valued my relationships with Turkish intelligence, security, military, and diplomatic leaders. I'm therefore especially pleased to contribute to this conversation. The title of your panel is Intelligence, NATO's Invisible Bond, and I can think of no better description. When most people think about NATO, they think about military power. They think about aircraft, ships, missiles, battle groups, and increasingly emerging technologies. And those capabilities are essential. But they really only matter if allies share a common understanding of the threats that they face. And that understanding begins with intelligence. People often describe NATO as the strongest military alliance in history, and I agree. But I would also argue that NATO is the strongest intelligence and security alliance in history. Think about what that means. What challenge can we not better understand when we draw upon the perspectives of 32 nations and more than 85 intelligence and security services? No single nation sees everything. No single intelligence service possesses every source, every perspective, or every answer. But together, allies create a shared understanding of the world that is broader, deeper, and more resilient than any one nation can achieve alone. That is NATO's intelligence advantage. And that advantage does not come from bureaucracy. It does not come from technology. It comes from trust, and it comes from relationships. It comes from sovereign nations making the deliberate choice to work together in pursuit of our common security. That point's important. NATO intelligence is fundamentally a voluntary enterprise. Every ally remains sovereign. Every intelligence and security service remains sovereign. Nations decide what they share, how they share it, and whom they cooperate with, and they should. NATO does not replace national intelligence services. It amplifies them. The fundamental proposition of NATO intelligence is that sovereign nations are stronger, smarter, and safer than they are apart. When I arrived in Brussels in 2019 as NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security, I believed strongly that the alliance's intelligence enterprise needed to become faster, more integrated, and more relevant to decision makers. President Macron had recently described NATO as brain dead. While I never shared that assessment, I did believe the alliance faced a moment of strategic adaptation. The threats confronting NATO were evolving faster than many of our institutions. Russia was becoming more aggressive. China was emerging as a strategic challenge. Hybrid threats were becoming more sophisticated. Cyber operations, disinformation, economic coercion, and attacks against democratic institutions were increasingly occurring below the threshold of traditional armed conflict. So shortly after arriving, I told my division that I believed war would likely come during my tenure, and not because I possessed special insight, rather because the strategic indicators increasingly pointed in that direction. I believed that if war came, it would most likely involve Ukraine or Georgia, and that judgment shaped how I approached the role. I often joke that leading NATO intelligence was like serving as the CEO of a multinational conglomerate, except that instead of business units, you're trying to align sovereign governments. And instead of one board of directors, you have 32 nations, today 32. The challenge was never collecting information. The challenge was creating shared understanding. The challenge was helping the alliance move from insight to action. And that became one of my central objectives. We worked to strengthen intelligence integration across the alliance. We deepened relationships among national services. We increased the tempo and quality of intelligence and security cooperation. We improved intelligence support to the Secretary General, the Military Committee, and the North Atlantic Council, and therefore to the nations themselves. And most importantly, we sought to professionalize and integrate the enterprise while preserving the national ownership that makes NATO intelligence effective. I think the role of the Assistant Secretary General is often misunderstood. I did not command NATO's intelligence services. They did not work for me. My responsibility was to help the alliance make better use of the extraordinary capabilities that already existed within allied nations. The Assistant Secretary General helps to prioritize, enable, orchestrate, and advocate. Above all, he helps bring the best expertise from across the alliance into support of allied debate, decision-making, and action. So in many respects, I think that's the essence of alliance leadership. And nowhere was that more apparent than during the period leading up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In early 2021, I began hearing increasing concern from Ukrainian intelligence leaders with whom I maintained regular contact. They were seeing very troubling indicators: Russian force movements, changes in readiness, information operations, and escalating pressure across the gray zone between peace and conflict. And at NATO, we were seeing very much the same. As the year progressed, exercises such as Zapad 2021 reinforced concerns that Russia was preparing for something larger. By the end of 2021, many of us believed the risk had become quite significant. The challenge, however, was not prediction. The challenge was alignment. History will likely record that Western intelligence predicted Russia's invasion with remarkable accuracy. But prediction was never the hardest part. The hardest part was helping 30 sovereign nations reach a common understanding of what that warning actually meant and what should be done about it. Different capitals saw different aspects of the problem. Different intelligence services brought different perspectives. Different governments faced different political pressures. One question I heard repeatedly from Allied representatives in those final weeks has remained with me ever since, and it was, can our allies depend on us? That was the real question. Not whether Russia would invade, but whether the alliance could act together when it mattered. And intelligence helped answer that question by creating understanding, by building confidence, by helping leaders see not only the threat itself, but the consequences of inaction. One of the most important lessons I learned from that experience is that intelligence success is not measured solely by whether analysts correctly predict events. Intelligence success is measured by whether intelligence helps leaders make better decisions. Intelligence creates decision advantage, but decision advantage is not limited to crisis response. NATO also requires intelligence to help forecast a future operating environment. The alliance depends upon what we often describe as 360-degree awareness, understanding challenges that may emerge from any direction across every domain and at every level of competition. That includes challenges from the east, south, and high north, as well as competition in space and cyberspace, the contested information environment, and hybrid activities deliberately designed to blur the line between peace and conflict. The purpose of intelligence is not simply to observe these developments. It is to help the alliance prioritize among them, assess their implications, and determine where collective action and resources should be focused. Those judgments shape deterrence and defense. They help allies determine what diplomatic, military, economic, technological, and informational actions are necessary to build confidence, strengthen deterrence, and reassure populations and partners. They help guide some of NATO's most important long-term decisions: interoperability standards, capability targets, force requirements, readiness objectives, resilience investments, and planning priorities. In this sense, then, intelligence is not merely a warning function. It is an essential input into how the alliance plans, prepares, and adapts for the future. That challenge is becoming more important, not less. The strategic environment confronting the alliance is becoming more complex, more contested, and more technologically dynamic. The warning time available to leaders is shrinking. The pace of decision-making required during crises is accelerating. And our adversaries are becoming increasingly sophisticated. For NATO, this means intelligence and security cooperation must continue to evolve, particularly in the areas of cooperation, strategic adaptation, emerging technologies, and resilience. Artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, autonomous systems, and new methods of data integration are already transforming intelligence in every one of our nations. Those technologies offer enormous opportunities. But technology alone will not solve our challenges. As information becomes more abundant, human judgment then becomes even more important. Technology can generate insight, but only leaders can generate wisdom. Resilient societies are harder to coerce. Resilient infrastructure is harder to disrupt. Resilient institutions are harder to manipulate, and resilient alliances are harder to divide. Looking ahead, NATO faces a period of sustained strategic competition unlike anything we've experienced since the Cold War. The threat environment is becoming more dangerous. The margin for error is becoming smaller, and the warning to decision window is shrinking. The decisions NATO leaders take at upcoming summits, including here in Ankara, will help determine whether the alliance is prepared for that future. Readiness, resilience, technology, security are all essential, but none of them will function without trust. And trust remains NATO's greatest strategic advantage. In one of the most consequential periods in modern European security, I learned a lesson that remains true today. We are stronger together. Not because we surrender sovereignty or always agree, but because sovereign nations freely choose to cooperate together in pursuit of common security. That principle is at the foundation of NATO. It is also the foundation of NATO intelligence. In the end, NATO's most important intelligence asset is not a satellite, it is not a sensor, it is not an algorithm, it is the willingness of allies to trust one another with their most sensitive information and their most consequential decisions. Trust enables sharing, sharing enables understanding, and understanding enables action. Action is what ultimately gives an alliance its credibility. That was true during the Ukraine crisis, and it's true today. And I believe it will remain true for NATO's future. So again, thank you for the opportunity to join you, and I wish you a highly productive and successful conference. Thank you.